Imagine a single institution knowing the deepest secrets of every person in an entire continent. Their fears, their debts, their betrayals, their desires, their political loyalties, their private doubts about the very system demanding their disclosure. Not gathered through surveillance or interrogation, not extracted through torture or threat, gathered willingly in a wooden box from people who believed that speaking was the only path to forgiveness and that withholding was a sin in itself. For nearly 1,000 years, that institution was the Catholic Church, and the ritual that made it possible had a name most people recognize without understanding how it actually worked, what it cost the people who used it, what it built, or what it eventually became. This is the history of confession. Before going any further, one thing needs to be said clearly. At its spiritual core, the impulse to confess is one of the most genuinely human things that exists. The need to speak what weighs on you, to name what you've done, to hear that you can still be forgiven. That impulse predates every religion and every institution. But institutions have a way of finding the most human things and building systems around them. And what was built around confession is one of the most fascinating and one of the most consequential structures in Western history. Long before Christianity organized around it, the act of confessing wrong was present across nearly every ancient spiritual tradition. In Egypt, the Book of the Dead contains what scholars call a negative confession. The soul of the deceased reciting, before the divine court, a list of things they had not done in life. I have not stolen. I have not killed. I have not caused suffering to others. Wrongs spoken out loud in ritual form as the gateway to judgment and to what came after. In the Israelite tradition, communal confession was practiced annually on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the entire people collectively naming their failures before God, a practice that continues to this day. In Buddhist monasteries, monks gathered regularly in ceremonies called pati, where they formally acknowledged violations of their code to the assembled community, with those who had nothing to confess signaling so through silence. In Roman religious practice, certain festivals included public rituals of expiation, the naming and releasing of collective wrongs. The pattern was strikingly consistent across traditions, with no contact between them. Naming the wrong in front of someone or something greater than oneself was how the burden was supposed to lift. The impulse to externalize guilt is not a product of religious tradition. The traditions found it already there and organized themselves around it. But in the earliest centuries of Christianity, confession looked almost nothing like what it would eventually become. In the 1st and 2nd centuries, Christians who had committed serious sins after baptism, what the tradition called grave scenes, went through a process called public penance. They confessed openly in front of the entire congregation. They were assigned a period of visible separation from full participation in communal life, sometimes lasting years, during which they stood at the back of the church, were excluded from receiving communion, and were known to everyone around them as people undergoing penance, and they were eventually readmitted through a public ceremony of reconciliation. It was a community ritual, not a private one. The priest was not a confidential listener. The community itself was the witness, and the process could only be undertaken once in a lifetime. There was no weekly or annual reset. If you fell again after being restored, that was considered a deeper problem than penance could address. This system had one enormous strength and one enormous weakness. The strength was authenticity. There was no way to game it quietly, no way to confess in the morning and repeat the same behavior in the afternoon without the community knowing. The weakness was that it was so severe and so public that many Christians simply delayed penance indefinitely, waiting until they were near death to confess, in order to avoid the years of social penalty that came with it. Some lived their entire adult lives outside the full sacramental life of the church, not because they didn't believe, but because the cost of formal reconciliation was too high to pay while still young enough to sin again. This is where the first major transformation happened, and it came not from Rome, but from the far edge of the known Christian world. It's worth pausing on that for a moment. The practice that would eventually give the medieval church its most intimate access to the inner lives of its members did not originate in any papal decree or conciliar decision. It emerged organically from the pastoral challenges of small monastic communities, trying to help ordinary people manage ordinary moral failure, in a tradition that Rome eventually absorbed, codified, and then scaled across an entire civilization. In the monasteries of Ireland and Celtic Britain, beginning in the 6th century, a different approach to confession began taking shape. Monks developed a practice of regularly confessing to a spiritual director, a trusted guide, in private. What emerged from these conversations was something unprecedented. Written guides called manuals that listed specific scenes alongside specific penalties. The logic was almost contractual. Confess this act. Perform this penance. The account is settled. It was a system designed for repeatability, for regular use, for ordinary people navigating ordinary moral failures rather than catastrophic public falls. The penalties themselves were remarkably detailed. Different fasts for different violations, different durations for different circumstances, whether the sin involved a clergyman or a layperson, whether it was a first offense or a repeated one, whether intent was involved or whether it happened through negligence, whether it was committed alone or with others. These manuals ran 4 pages. Some of the surviving penitentials from this period covered violations the modern reader would not expect to find in a religious document, catalogued with the specificity of a legal code. They were, in effect, the first systematic moral inventory of human behavior in the early medieval world, applied privately, between one person and one confessor, with no community witness and no public consequence beyond the penance assigned. Irish missionaries carried this practice into continental Europe during the 6th and 7th centuries, and it spread rapidly. By the 8th century, private, auricular confession, meaning confession whispered into the ear of a priest, had become widespread across much of the church. The question of whether a priest actually had the authority to forgive sin in God's name, rather than simply declaring the community's willingness to receive someone back, had become a matter of active theological dispute. But the practice was spreading faster than the theology could catch up with it. And then came 1215. The Fourth Lateran Council, convened by Pope Innocent III, is one of the most consequential gatherings in medieval history. More than 400 bishops attended, along with abbots and representatives from across the Christian world. Among its 70 canons, one stands out for what it changed about the daily life of every Catholic in Europe. Canon 21 required every Christian who had reached the age of reason to confess their sins, privately to their own parish priest, at least once a year, specifically during the season of Lent, and to receive communion at Easter. Failure to comply could result in denial of entry to a church during one's lifetime and denial of Christian burial after death. Read that slowly. Every person across all of Catholic Europe, which at that point meant the vast majority of the population of the continent, required by law to go into a private room with an ordained priest and speak their sins out loud every year. Every year, without exception. Under the threat of exclusion from the community of the faithful and from its rituals of farewell to the dead, the Church had just created, in a single decree, the most comprehensive and regular system for gathering intimate personal information ever assembled in the pre-modern world. Nothing in secular governance of the era came close. No king had a mechanism that brought every subject annually into a private room under a religious obligation to full honesty, with the threat of spiritual consequences for concealment. No civil administration had anything approaching the parish network, reaching into every village, every town, every neighborhood in every city across the continent, staffed by trained men under institutional discipline and hierarchical oversight. The scale of what Canon 21 created has no real parallel in Western history. Before the modern state, consider what a parish priest heard in a medieval village. He heard about marriages in trouble, about conflicts between spouses that hadn't yet reached any public forum. He heard about who owed money to whom and hadn't repaid it, about broken business agreements and concealed assets. He heard about feuds between families, about who hated whom and why, about grudges that were shaping relationships in ways no outsider could see. He heard about sexual behavior, about violations of the Church's extensive and detailed rules regarding intimacy inside marriage and outside of it. He heard about political alliances, about whether certain villagers were sympathetic to lords or factions the Church considered problematic, He heard about doubts regarding church teaching itself, about quiet sympathies toward ideas being circulated at the margins of acceptable thought. He heard, in other words, everything, not the public face of his community, but the private reality underneath it. The gap between who people appeared to be and who they actually were, gathered annually, made obligatory by a combination of spiritual fear and social expectation, guaranteed by the belief, carefully maintained by the church, that withholding in confession was itself a grave sin that invalidated the entire sacrament. And above that village priest sat an entire hierarchy. The priest reported to a bishop. The bishop moved through networks of abbots, cathedral chapters, and papal legates. Information did not necessarily travel upward through formal channels, and the seal protected against direct disclosure. But the men at every level of the church understood what their position gave them access to, in terms of social knowledge, in terms of understanding where the communities under their care were actually going, what they actually feared, what they actually wanted. That understanding shaped decisions in ways that no record was ever kept of. The seal of confession, the absolute prohibition against the confessor revealing what was heard in the confessional, did protect the faithful in an important way. It guaranteed that confessions couldn't be used as direct evidence in secular courts, a protection that mattered considerably in an era when the distinction between religious and civil jurisdiction was often contested and unclear. But the seal protected the institution as much as it protected the individual, because what the church gathered through confession was never really testimony to be read in court. It was something subtler and more lasting than that. It was social knowledge, and social knowledge of what people fear, what people desire, and what people have done is the oldest form of institutional influence there is. It shaped what the church could claim to know about the spiritual health of its people. It shaped which scenes were emphasized from the pulpit in certain seasons, and which were quietly downplayed. It shaped how the institution understood which behaviors were spreading through a population, and which were declining, before any formal survey or census could capture that. It shaped, in ways that historians are still attempting to trace, what the institution chose to enforce actively, and what it chose to tolerate selectively, and crucially, toward whom. Powerful families who confessed to the same priests for generations. Merchant classes whose economic practices existed in perpetual tension with church teaching on usury. Nobles whose political decisions directly affected church property and privilege. The knowledge flowing into confessionals across Europe created a picture of society that no other institution in the pre-modern world possessed. There were also more direct cases in certain contexts, especially within powerful households, noble courts, and royal families. Confessors became advisors in ways that blurred every line between spiritual guidance and political counsel. A king's confessor was not simply a priest performing a sacrament. He was the one person in the kingdom to whom the king was expected, by religious obligation, to tell the complete truth about himself, including his doubts, his fears, his intentions, his private views of the people around him. The question of who occupied that position and whose interests that person ultimately represented was not an abstract theological matter. It was a question of proximity to power that families, factions, religious orders, and foreign governments actively contested for centuries. The Jesuit order, founded in the 16th century and known for the rigorous intellectual formation of its members, became particularly associated with royal confession across Catholic Europe in the period following the Reformation. Jesuit confessors served kings and queens from France to Portugal to Poland to the Spanish court to the Holy Roman Emperor. The specific relationship between what those confessors heard in the confessional and what advice, framing, or perspective flowed back through conversation and counsel is a chapter of European history that has never been fully reconstructed. Partly because the seal made the inside of those exchanges permanently inaccessible. What historians can observe is the output. Decisions made, policies adopted, alliances formed or broken, individuals elevated or abandoned. The input, what was spoken in the room before those decisions, remains behind the seal. Critics at the time called it sinister. Defenders called it pastoral care at the highest level. Both were probably right. and then the whole system shook. Martin Luther, a former Augustinian monk, with direct experience of the penitential system from the inside, launched his attack on confession in the early 16th century, not only as a theological objection, but as a structural one. He argued that the scriptural basis for a priest having the authority to absolve sin was far weaker than the Church claimed, and that the centuries of theological elaboration built around that claim had produced a system that served the institution more reliably than it served the people using it, that the elaborate system of penances had become in many cases a mechanism for managing and monetizing guilt rather than actually addressing it, that the annual obligation created ideal conditions for manipulation, for using the fear of divine consequence to extract compliance, for calibrating what was demanded of different classes and communities based on what the institution needed from them, for keeping populations in a perpetual relationship of spiritual debt, that the entire architecture of the confessional was, to a significant degree, a human invention that had accumulated around a genuinely biblical impulse, but had grown far beyond anything that original impulse had intended or required. Protestant reformers abolished auricular confession. Lutherans retained a form of general confession and absolution, but rejected the mandatory private disclosure to a priest. Reformed and Calvinist traditions rejected it more thoroughly. The Anglican settlement was characteristically ambiguous, but across the Protestant world, the private confessional, as a mandatory institutional practice, was dismantled, and with it, a significant portion of the information architecture that had underpinned church authority for 3 centuries. The Council of Trent, the Catholic Church's response to the Reformation, reaffirmed and strengthened the doctrine of confession in the mid-16th century. The confessional box itself, the enclosed wooden structure that separated priest and penitent by a screen, was actually introduced and standardized in this period, largely in response to concerns about abuse and about the practical problems of physical proximity. The screen was in some ways a reform. It was also, architecturally, a new way of organizing the same conversation. What's striking, looking at all of this from a distance, is how a ritual genuinely rooted in a real human need, the need to speak the truth about oneself to someone who will not destroy you for it, became so thoroughly entangled with questions of power, control, and institutional self. That entanglement didn't make the spiritual core of the practice false. The need it addressed was, and remains, real. People left confessionals genuinely relieved. People found the courage to change after naming what they had done out loud to another human being. But it did mean that for centuries, 2 things existed simultaneously inside the same wooden box: genuine pastoral care and structural observation, real forgiveness and real leverage, the soul seeking relief and the institution accumulating knowledge. And the people kneeling on the other side of the screen could not always distinguish between the two, because from their side, they both looked exactly like the same thing. That tension was never resolved from within. It was dissolved, for a large part of the Western world, by the Reformation, which dismantled the mandatory institutional structure while the underlying human need remained entirely intact. And then the need quietly reappeared in a different room with a different name, administered by a different profession, protected by a different kind of seal. In 1895, Joseph Breuer and a young Sigmund Freud published a paper describing a talking cure for hysteria. The method was disarmingly simple. A patient lay on a couch or sat in a chair and spoke everything, without censorship, without being guided toward a predetermined conclusion, to a trained listener who was legally and professionally obligated to strict confidentiality. And in the speaking, something happened. Patterns that had been invisible became visible. Material that had been suppressed surfaced into language. The burden of what hadn't been said began, sometimes, to lift. Freud himself was aware of the historical parallel. He was not religious, and he maintained sharp critical distances from the institutions of religion throughout his career. But he knew what he was building resembled something old. The talking cure replaced the priest with the analyst, replaced divine forgiveness with psychological insight, replaced the confessional box with the consulting room, and replaced the seal of confession with professional confidentiality. It placed the listener in a position of structured, protected intimacy, receiving disclosures that the person speaking had typically never made to anyone else. The furniture changed. The confessional screen became the leather couch. The absolution formula became the therapeutic frame. The impulse driving both, the need to say the unspeakable to someone who won't use it to destroy you, did not change at all. Today, the act of speaking one's failures, fears, and hidden truths to a trained and confidential listener is not primarily associated with religion. In most of the Western world, it's associated with mental health. Millions of people do it weekly. Insurance companies are expected to pay for it. We have hotlines for it, apps for it, entire professional infrastructures built around it, licensing boards, ethical codes, mandatory reporting requirements, professional associations. And the reason all of that exists in its full institutional complexity is that something about speaking the unspeakable to someone who won't use it against you appears to be at sommet level necessary for human beings to function, not spiritually necessary in any specifically religious sense, just necessary. The medieval church did not invent the most elaborate system the world had yet seen for channeling that need through a single institution with a single hierarchy, operating under a single set of rules, gathering a single kind of knowledge across an entire civilization. It lasted for centuries. It shaped the moral vocabulary of the Western world. It produced genuine spiritual consolation for millions of people across hundreds of years. And it simultaneously built one of the most extensive structures for institutional social observation ever assembled in the pre-modern West. Both things were true at the same time. Both things happened in the same room. And what made the system sustainable across centuries was precisely the seal. Because the seal didn't just protect the pen, it protected the entire architecture. It meant that what the church knew could never be directly examined, never directly challenged, never fully reconstructed by any outside observer. The seal guaranteed that the institutional knowledge gathered through confession was also permanently deniable. Nobody could prove that anything heard in a confessional had ever influenced a decision, shaped a policy, or been used to manage a person. The information existed inside the institution, and the institution alone decided what to do with it. That combination, intimate, mandatory disclosure, plus absolute institutional confidentiality, is a structure of power that no secular institution in the pre-modern world managed to replicate at anywhere near the same scale. And it was built not through coercion, but through theology. Not through force, but through faith. Maybe that's the most honest thing to say about the confessional. Across all its forms and all its history, it has always been two things at once: a genuine offer of relief and a structure of observation, a door toward freedom and a gathering of information, a room where people came seeking God, and a room where an institution learned what people were. The question of which of those was more true in any given moment, in any given room, between any given priest and any given person kneeling in the dark, is one that no historical record can fully answer. Because the seal held, the secret stayed inside, and whatever was said, whatever was learned, whatever was done with knowing it, is permanently beyond recovery, protected, as promised, by the oldest confidentiality agreement in Western history.